This is A Word, a podcast from Slate. I'm your host, Jason Johnson. Journalists are under fire like never before, targeted for hatred and violence by politicians who don't like the way they report the facts. To veteran journalist Ali Velshi, who was shot while doing his job, a free press is something worth fighting for.
Being a citizen and a journalist means I have work to do to let my fellow Americans know more about what's going on in the streets of America and how we can fix it.
Ali Velshi on his memoir, Small Acts of Courage, A Legacy of Endurance and the Fight for Democracy, coming up on A Word with me, Jason Johnson. Stay with us.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Forget the frustration of picking commerce platforms when you switch your business to Shopify, the global commerce platform that supercharges your selling wherever you sell. With Shopify, you'll harness the same intuitive features, trusted apps, and powerful analytics used by the world's leading brands. Sign up today for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/tech, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/tech.
Whoa. Landing an account this big will totally change my landscaping business. It's going to mean hiring more guys and more equipment and new trucks for the new guys to drive the new equipment in. I don't know if I'm ready.
You can do this, and Ford Pro FinSimple can help. Our experts are ready to make growing pains less painful for your business with flexible financing solutions that meet the needs of your business today when you need them. Get started at fordpro.com/financing.
Welcome to A Word, a podcast about race and politics and everything else. I'm your host, Jason Johnson. The idea of journalism as heroic and the celebration of the immigrant success story both kind of feel like relics of an America that no longer exists. But there are still reporters who embrace their work as vital to upholding democracy. And there are still immigrants who come to the United States eager to build new lives and make the American dream a reality for their families. Both of these ideas are at the heart of the new book, Small Acts of Courage, A Legacy of Endurance and the Fight for Democracy. It's a memoir written by veteran journalist Ali Velshi, who traces his passion for social justice and fearless truth-telling back generations and across 3 continents. After years of success in Canada, Velshi began his American journalism career in New York on 9/11. Since then, he's risen through the ranks of political and business reporting and is the host of his own self-titled show on MSNBC. I am so happy to have him here. He's one of the most respected journalists in the business. Ali Velshi, welcome to A Word.
Thank you, my friend.
I really, really enjoyed your book. And I know this is sort of a generic question, but, you know, it's kind of a family story. It's a political story. What made you want to release this book now in 2024? You've published several books in the past, so you know what cycle it's going to come out in. What made you say, I got to tell this story right now?
Well, a couple of things. One is because I live in the perspective journalism space, I thought it might be helpful for my viewers to understand how I see the world, why I form the opinions I have formed. And part of that is because I've got this, like everybody does, this history behind me that informs my worldview, my view of politics, my view of how society can run, my view of immigration, my view of justice, racial justice. For 125 years, my family has lived this life and this struggle and has sought racial equality and democracy and stability and justice. And that's why it's so important for me on my shows and in my journalism to pursue these stories of people and their aspirations and how we become more equal as a society. And one of the things in my background, because my family went from India to South Africa to Kenya, they lived in places where some people had it good. Some people thought they had democracy. Some people thought it was equal. And it really has resonated with me that until we all have it, until we're all treated the same, until we can all vote, until my rights are the same as somebody who needs an abortion, the fight's not over. And I really thought the fight was over. And to me, as a journalist, we can be foot soldiers in the fight for the preservation of democracy. That's not partisan. That's not losing your objectivity. In the same way that we don't like when hurricanes destroy places and we don't like murder, we don't like attacks on democracy and justice and rights. So this was in large part a framing of why I see the world the way I do.
I always find that fascinating as a political scientist and also somebody who does journalism, where people come from has a lot to do with how they view a functioning democracy. Talk a little bit about how your family lived for quite a while in South Africa, where there was not freedom. Then they moved to Kenya, where things are nominally sort of democratic, and then become politically active in Canada, which is sort of a fantastical version of how we think America should operate. How do you think that changed your perception of what democracy should be?
Well, it gave me a lot of shades of gray, right? South Africa was a place that under apartheid was absolutely not a democracy the way we'd see it. But for the 5% of the population who got to vote, it was a wonderful democracy. It was fantastic. So my parents got out of that and they go to Kenya, and they arrived in Kenya before Kenya got independent. So they got to watch the dawn of independence, the birth of a new nation, a democratic nation. And while everything wasn't equal for a lot of important reasons in Kenya, everybody could walk on the same sidewalks and go to the movie theater. And, the crazy stuff that was apartheid was not there, but there were still remnants of colonialism. And so when they got to Canada, I think literally before they unpacked their bags, they were going to political events. They went to events for all the different political parties. They were so desperate to hug democracy, to find a place that they could call their own. And when they found it in Canada, they stayed. They decided, we are in this. They understood that citizenship is not just the rights that they didn't have in South Africa. It's the obligations that you have when you have that citizenship. And that's a remarkable lesson to me, that forget the fact that it's just about the rights that you are owed. It is about what you owe society back to make it a better place.
Talk a little bit about your grandfather and him working a farm with Gandhi, and how his sort of philosophy and what he did sort of influenced your family and what you all became.
So my grandfather in 1910, at the age of 7, became Gandhi's youngest student on his ashram in South Africa. Now, the whole point of the ashram, a commune, if you will, was Gandhi felt that people, particularly Indians, were losing the enthusiasm for the fight. People get tired of it, right? People just want to go out and live their lives and earn their money. And two is Indians had it better off than black people, or what they called colored people in South Africa, which were mixed race people. And there's a real instinct in this divide and conquer of the races to have people not join forces with one another because you've got it a little better than someone else does. So they weren't as well off as the whites, but they weren't as badly off as the blacks. And Gandhi needed to have people understand that fighting injustice takes some discomfort. And he didn't think he had the foot soldiers for it. So he opened this farm up and he said, come and live on this farm. He asked my great-grandfather, who was just his friend, let me have your son as my student. And my great-grandfather said to him, Gandhi, you're a Hindu, I'm a Muslim. That's not going to work out very well, because back then schools were, tied into faith and religion. So Gandhi says, I will learn your faith to teach it to him. So my grandfather, and subsequently my family, learned their Muslim faith from a Hindu who read the book. But that was the pluralism with which my grandfather grew up. And he grew up with 2 blankets. One is what you slept on, and the other one went on top of you. There was no hot water. They were trained to go to prison. They were trained to resist apartheid. They were trained to literally walk into the entrance of the train station. It was just like the American South, right? Stupid stuff where there were 2 entrances. And just like they did in the civil rights movement, they would tell the police that they were going in. They'd go in, they'd get arrested, they'd go to jail. The judge would sentence them to 30 days in jail or a £5 fine. They'd all take jail. They'd fill up the jails. And literally the day they came out, they'd go back and do it again. When you can't take something from someone, when you can't take their hot water or their comfortable bed, then jail's fine. And so Gandhi did that to toughen my grandfather and 70 other students up, and it worked. And I will say, my grandfather died before I was born, thinking that he had failed. He thought that all the work he had done to fight apartheid had failed. And the thing about the book is it tells you that it didn't fail. Things happened in my family that my grandfather could not have imagined happening. He wanted to fight small injustices in apartheid, and his family went on to make big changes to the world.
We're going to take a short break. We come back more with Ali Velshi about his new book, Small Acts of Courage. This is A Word with Jason Johnson. Stay tuned.
This is the story of the one. As a maintenance engineer, he hears things differently. To the untrained ear, everything on his shop floor might sound fine, but he can hear gears grinding or a belt slipping. So he steps in to fix the problem at hand before it gets out of hand. And he knows Granger's got the right product he needs to get the job done, which is music to his ears. Call, click Granger.com, or just stop by. Granger, for the ones who get it done.
You're listening to A Word with Jason Johnson. Today, we're talking with MSNBC's Ali Velshi about his memoir, Small Acts of Courage. One of the most striking images is Ali writing about when he arrives in America 2 days after September 11th on his Honda bike, coming into New York, biking his way in because he'd already gotten rid of his car. What was it like coming into the United States to begin your journalism career at really, from most journalists and historians' perspective, the beginning of one of the most polarizing periods in this country? You were a Muslim, you're Canadian, you're coming into this place on a motorbike. What was that like? Other than the awe of New York, just realizing what was actually going on in the country at the time.
The awe of New York combined with the trauma immediately after 9/11 and all of the things that would come from that, including the wars overseas. When you grow up in Canada and you're looking at America all the time, and when I was a kid, we watched all the same TV shows. I was in awe of America, but what a time to come in. I was actually a little worried about it because I didn't have a car. I was on this motorbike. It was a faxed copy of a visa because you couldn't get your visa because a visa would be FedEx to you and there were no planes flying. So I was worried as a Muslim coming in, what would happen? And I was pleasantly surprised, and maybe it's just the circles in which I was operating in Manhattan journalism circles. I didn't experience personally any animosity when I came in. But you're right, Jason. I wasn't bargaining for that. I was a business journalist. I was just going to play in a bigger pond, basically, by coming to the United States. And that literally when I entered, the world changed. And getting used to that has been really interesting because Canada didn't go through something similar. And the strong reactions we saw after 9/11 and the things that it led us to influenced the way I think about journalism, because we don't have good citizenship if we don't have well-informed citizens. And even back then, people were misinformed. They were falling for propaganda. They were not understanding the fullness of these stories, particularly when your country's attacked. You don't necessarily pause to understand the fullness of the story. That's not the moment in which people want to do that, but those are the moments in which it's necessary. And if people don't willingly want to absorb those stories, it's on us, Jason, as journalists to say, look, we've got to tell you what's really going on. We've got to give you the context so you understand it. So you don't spend 20 years at trillions of dollars in wars that you don't want to be involved in. I understand why people make the decisions they do. I understand why people get angry. We're seeing it around the world this very day. But it doesn't matter. We as journalists have a role to keep people informed of the full context.
One of the great things about the work that you do and what you're able to see is you're the guy who's called for everything, whether there's a hurricane, there's a storm, there's a conflict. And you talk a lot about in this book about, some of the moments that you got to see and how emotional people were when, say, Obama got elected. What's the transition like when you move from an Al Jazeera, when you move from Canadian broadcasting to now having to talk to an American audience that doesn't necessarily get what the rest of the world thinks of us, that doesn't necessarily think holistically of some of our military enterprises? How did that change your journalism, or did it change your journalism?
This is a really, really astute question, because maybe it did, or maybe Donald Trump did. Because Donald Trump gave Americans a clearer view of what the world thinks of Americans than Americans might have had if not for Donald Trump. Some people didn't like American policy overseas or in the Middle East or whatever the case may be, but generally thought that having a cop was better than not having a cop on the world stage. And at least America wasn't deliberately at all times trying to break all the China. And then Donald Trump shows up and has some remarkable ability to upend every convention we think about, every norm that we understand. So on one hand, Donald Trump helped because he caused Americans to say, oh my God, they're looking at us like we're a little bit crazy. On the other hand, Al Jazeera realized that if this audience at MSNBC doesn't understand some of the things that audience understood, then it It's on us to make that clearer. Cut the piece of pie in a thinner slice so that people can absorb that. People are not to be faulted for not understanding everything they don't understand and not reading the books they don't know that they might be reading. Look at after George Floyd died, the hunger there was, after George Floyd was murdered, let's be accurate, the hunger there was for people to understand inequality. Liberals who thought this place was pretty equal. They didn't know the books they hadn't read. And then so many of us came to read those books together. That's how I see it, right? That I went in there saying, there are things you need to understand about the world and our place in it. And let's go through this together. Let's learn them together. Let's not be condescending to our audience. Let's not be condescending to those who don't know the things we as journalists, as generalists should know. I love talking to academics and really getting into the work that they do and getting into these thin slices. And my audience has beautifully given me the permission to keep on doing those things that in TV land sometimes doesn't seem sensible. But if we're all just getting smarter and able to make our decisions better because of the things that we learn. And again, Jason, I've been in cable for a long time, and I think we contributed to some of this polarization in society. So toward the end of my career, I'd like to do some things to fix that. And this common understanding of the problems we face together is one of those areas that I lean into.
I want to highlight this because this is a critical moment, not just in the book, but honestly, I think in journalism and sort of American political history. You talk about like the 3 steps to fully becoming a citizen, and you tell this amazing story about getting shot while covering the protests about George Floyd and how that was like a moment of clarity for you about how journalism worked and everything else like that. Just tell us a little bit about that experience.
First of all, I got shot below my knee with a rubber bullet, which doesn't sound as serious, except they're bullets covered in rubber. They're not Nerf, bullets. But I was walking with protesters. There was no violence involved at all. There was no provocation at all. And all of a sudden, into the intersection in front of us came National Guard and State Police and Minneapolis Police, and they literally opened fire. They started shooting tear gas and flashbangs and rubber bullets all over the place. So that was weird because the general thought is when people are rounding up protesters, the protesters must have been doing something really bad. And I was there to bear witness. I was there to tell you that is simply not true. Number 2, as journalists, people say to you, what a great job. You've got a front row seat to everything that's happening. And in that moment, I realized this is not a front row seat. We're in the arena. We are in it. And number 3 is my parents arrived on these shores in Canada more than 50 years ago, thinking that their, at that point, 75-year family journey to find democracy and liberty and equality was done. And I fully grew up with the privilege of thinking that was done. And in that moment, I realized that is not my privilege. That is not my right to think it's done. That is not my right to think I'm not part of a linkage to my ancestors and other people's ancestors, and that when we are not all free, we're not free. And so it was that moment in which I realized I need to suck up the idea that being a citizen is not just about the things you get. It's about the things you have to do. And being a citizen and a journalist means I have work to do to let my fellow Americans know more about what's going on in the streets of America and how we can fix it.
We're going to take a short break. When we come back, we'll talk more with journalist Ali Velshi about his new memoir, Small Acts of Courage. This is A Word with Jason Johnson. Stay tuned. You're listening to A Word with Jason Johnson. Today, we're talking with journalist Ali Velshi about his new book, Small Acts of Courage. Ali, one of the things that really drove me and impressed me in this book is you talking about race. You said this really fascinating thing when you talked about growing up in Toronto and growing up in a really multicultural environment. You said you realized, or from your perspective, there was a difference between growing up in a racist country, like your older sister did in apartheid South Africa, versus Canada, which is a country that just happens to have some racists. Which would you describe America as? Would you say America is a racist country, or it's a country that's got some racists in it?
It's got some loud racists in it, that's for sure. It's got some racists in it who are feeling either empowered or super threatened. And I'm not sure, and maybe it's both. I want very badly to believe that it is a country that's got some racists in it. I'd like to reclaim the idea that we are not a racist society. We do not have to be a racist society. There may be racist among us. That's what a pluralistic society has. We have to be able to remember that we have ways of making sure that that doesn't take over who we are. And one of those ways is the vote. One of those ways is registering. One of those ways is fighting injustice. And what we've seen in the last couple of years, Jason, is that in America, people have looked at stark injustice and said, I'm going to do something about this. I'm going to mobilize. I'm going to vote. I'm going to protest or do whatever it is you do. I don't think we've got the final say on who wins this thing, but I would like to stake out the claim that America is not a racist country. But like everything else in my book, in order to make that true or to keep that true, that takes work on all of our part. We can't let our guard down. We can't just make that statement and say, America is a country that has racists in it, but it's not a racist country, so I'm good. If that is true, if what I'm saying is true, that means we all have to work to make that true.
Your family history is replete with amazing stories of dealing with both institutional and personal racism. You said something fascinating in the book about, despite all of the racism that was experienced in different places, being kicked out of countries when Idi Amin said, hey, I don't want any more Indian people in Uganda. But you said your family didn't get angry. Talk a little bit about how they weren't angry, how people didn't wake up every day and say, I hate this kind of people, I hate that kind of people.
Well, one of the things I write about is the day I watched Nelson Mandela come out of prison. I was a student in Canada at that point. And two things stand out to me is that when the pictures we all had of Nelson Mandela until that day was he was a chubby guy. He was a boxer. And he came out rail thin and smiling. 27 years incarcerated. And he came out smiling. If I've been incarcerated for 27 hours, I might be mad for the rest of my life, number one. Number two, I spoke to a lot of family members who some are angrier than others, right? It has stuck with them. I think the reason my immediate family didn't get angry is because they very immediately channeled what would have been the anger into civil society, into politics, into feeling like, okay, we're going to let our new society, meaning Canada, our impressions of it be governed by whether or not they allow us a seat at the table. Right? All my parents ever wanted was a seat at the table. Most people who fight injustice are not looking for the whole enchilada, right? Not everybody says, I would like absolute freedom for everybody all the time. They would like to improve on this particular set of rights or infringements. So my family really wanted to see how close to the table they could get in Canada. And it was very early on. And, we got there in 1970, 1981, my dad decided to run for office. And he told an incredulous group in my living room that he was going to do that. And they all thought that was ridiculous. They said, you're not going to win. And he said, we won't know if I can win or not if we don't try, if we don't test the system. So he tested it and he lost. He subsequently won in another election. But apartheid was so full of petty BS, like my sister not being able to ride a horse because she's not white at the zoo, a pony ride, like these weird restrictions they had on my parents' businesses. It was this petty racism. What we have to worry about more in our society is the stuff that's generally speaking more sophisticated than that, right? The stuff that feels like exclusion and racism and sexism that operates on a level where people don't say the things they used to say in apartheid South Africa. And that's the work that we now have to do. I will say it's a little surprising to me in 2024, we've got some of that petty racism that my parents grew up with in apartheid still in America. I'm sort of fascinated by these people who utter racist things. I'm sort of fascinated that one of them is a leading candidate for president right now. Good people will say that's not who we are. The problem is all the insidious stuff, right? All the stuff that gets through the court, all the little rules that keep people from being their fullest selves. So the story about my sister riding a pony was really just a story about a little girl who wanted to be her fullest self and was told one day at a zoo, you can't do that. That's a story of many, many Americans.
I want to talk about your TED Talk. You delivered a TED Talk about how fake news and alternative facts are going to undermine, our society's ability to have functional conversations.
My first piece of advice to you is that if you wish to avoid the purveyors of fake news who live in dark alleys, stay out of the dark alleys. Trust and support traditional journalism, which is devoted to research and fact-checking and in-depth investigation of issues, the very journalism that is under attack right now.
And that was in 2017. It's now been 7 years. You've referred to the fact that, social media sort of can flatten conversations and intensify polarization. Where do you think we are now? Has the worst nightmare that you were sort of implying in your TED Talk, has that come true? Because I'll be honest, I've seen some deep fakes this year that have terrified me.
I was so naive in 2017. In fact, most of that TED Talk was around the idea that this was an economic venture, right? Fake news would proliferate because it was cheap and easy to get people to click on something, and you get a fraction of a cent for it, and people would just do it to make money. I didn't realize people would do it to wreck the world. Social media is a much more dangerous and unsavory place than it was in 2017 when I gave that talk. And it all comes down to the idea that social media works against a well-informed electorate. It plays into all of the emotions that politics has always played into. There's no question. People would give fiery speeches and newspapers were owned by political interests. But we now have an ability to spread horribleness with velocity that we can't fight. It's velocity that journalists like you and me can't push back on because it just happens at too great a speed with technology that is not at our disposal, but it's at somebody else's. I mean, I remember when I first started talking about the social media platforms censoring themselves, especially when it comes to guns and shooting. This was after the Christchurch massacre in New Zealand. I actually got tweets and messages from parents of Black children in America who said, that'd be the worst thing ever if you stop them from broadcasting, live streaming just because a gun showed up, because I'm actually hoping that that's the one thing that saves my boy's life. I got messages from people around the world who said, we have revolutions that exist on the basis that we can live stream the fact that the government shot into a crowd of unarmed people. So I don't think the world without social media is the answer. And I don't want to get away from a world in which we enjoy the freedom of speech. But there's got to be something in there that addresses the velocity with which dangerous untruths can spread. And I don't know that I'm smart enough to know what the answer is, but I know a lot of people think about this every day. And I know that government has to have a bigger role in how this works.
We are staring down the barrel of a rematch where you have Donald Trump running against Joe Biden. None of us like to get into the speculation game, but I do want to ask you this. Do you think any of us collectively in journalism have learned our lessons? Do you think the 24-hour cable network specifically have learned the lessons of 2016 and 2020? Or do you think that everyone is sort of just dancing to the same rhythm of the past because, hey, that's what gets ratings and that's what gets numbers?
I think that in 2016, we weren't clear on how potent and dangerous Donald Trump would be. And now with the Georgia indictment and the Michigan indictments of the fake electors and the Arizona indictments, this wasn't a bumbling clown car. This was a super sophisticated plot to overturn the will of the American people. So number one, I think the stakes are entirely different than they were in 2016 in hindsight. The other thing is that I think we should do things better, but I'm not sure we know what better looks like. Not running Donald Trump's rallies does give people a permission structure to ignore that Donald Trump is saying things that would make 2016 Donald Trump blush. The racism, the sexism, the anti-democratic stuff that he says needs to be out there, but it needs to be out there in context. And context with Donald Trump is always very difficult because of the speed with which he lies, the way in which he does it. But I meet a lot of journalists who say, you got to listen to those rallies. People should go to them to understand what you're up against. It's not normalcy. It's not the same as listening to a Joe Biden speech, whatever you think of listening to a Joe Biden speech. So I don't know that we've got a collective answer as to how does presenting Donald Trump to our audiences in 2024 look different than 2020 and 2016. I certainly don't know that I have a full answer. I do tend to talk a lot about the things Donald Trump says and parse them with experts on authoritarianism, experts on democracy to say, what is he saying here? Should we be alarmed by this, or do we write this off as more Donald Trump? I don't know what the answer is to that.
What's the one thing you want people to take from Small Acts of Courage? What's the thing where it's like, man, I want to make sure that people take this away when they're done reading this book?
So when you open the cover, the first thing on the jacket says, Small Acts of Courage matter. Sometimes they change the world. I want people to take away the idea that my grandfather thought he failed. He would never have imagined that his son lived in Canada and would get elected to major elected office. He never knew me. I look just like him. He would never have imagined that you and I would be having this conversation. There's nothing about this conversation that would have made sense to my grandfather, right? Who we are and the color of our skin and a national audience talking about politics and asking questions about society. And he died thinking he failed. Gandhi actually left South Africa in 1913 thinking that that experiment failed. You will plant a tree in whose shade you will not rest, but somebody will. Somebody will eat the fruit from that tree. You will influence someone. I guess my point is it doesn't have to be big. If we all do small things, if we all take one person to vote, then 100% of people will vote, right? Voting is a price of admission. That's not a heroic act for a citizen. You should be allowed to vote. You should be encouraged to vote, but do something else. And that something else can be making sure you have a library card, making sure you support your librarians, making sure you go to your kid's school, making sure that you, not the state, determine what your child will read in school, making sure you show up for every municipal election, every school board election. Then if you want, after all that, you can decide you might want to run for office. And you might lose, and understanding what losing looks like and feels like and saying, maybe I'll try again, but I'm giving the voter an option. Do you know how many districts in the South in this country people run unopposed? Unopposed in an election. I mean, even if you ran in some of these gerrymandered districts, you might get 25 or 30% of the vote, but at least 25 or 30% of the people had their say. They got to make a choice. So there's a lot you can do that does not involve boiling the ocean. And that's why the title matters more to me than anything else. We can fix things around us, and that to me is the answer.
Ali Velshi is an award-winning journalist and host on MSNBC. His new memoir, Small Acts of Courage, A Legacy of Endurance and the Fight for Democracy, is available now. Ali, it has been an absolute honor. Thank you so much. Please come back anytime. Thanks for coming on The Word.
Thank you for taking such great care of me here and for delving so deeply into the book. I'm deeply appreciative.
That's a word for this week. The show's email is aword@slate.com. This episode was produced by Ahyiana Angel. Ben Richmond is Slate's Senior Director of Podcast Operations. Alicia Montgomery is the Vice President of Slate Audio. Our theme music was produced by Don Will. I'm Jason Johnson. Tune in next week for A Word.